No urgency. No panic. Just a sentence spoken slowly, carefully, as if it had been rehearsed many times before it was finally released. It didn't sound dangerous. It didn't sound like guilt. It didn't even sound important. And that was the problem. Because once you understand what that confession actually meant, you realize it could only be spoken after everything else had already fallen apart. What kind of confession only makes sense after the damage is done? Before that night, there was nothing to warn me. No raised voices. No visible tension. No moment you could point to and say, this is where it started. Our relationship, built on routine, shared decisions, and quiet understanding, functioned the way trust is supposed to function, automatically. We spoke often, we laughed easily. Disagreements, when they happened, resolved themselves without leaving marks. Everything looked stable. But stability has a way of hiding movement beneath it. There were moments small enough to dismiss. A sentence that reframed a past event. A suggestion that subtly redirected responsibility. A pause where reassurance used to be. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they began to register somewhere deeper than logic. Nothing felt wrong. And yet, my body responded before my mind could explain why. If nothing was wrong, why did I feel it first there? The changes were not dramatic enough to confront. They arrived quietly, folded into ordinary conversation. A memory I referenced would be repeated back to me, slightly altered. Not wrong, just adjusted. A decision we had made together was later described as my idea alone. A conversation I remembered clearly was treated as vague, unfinished, open to interpretation. Each time I corrected it, each time the correction was met with calm agreement. That calm mattered, because disagreement usually carries friction. This did not. It felt cooperative, reasonable, almost helpful. I began keeping track, not consciously but instinctively. Replaying conversations in my head. Checking my recall against his certainty. Nothing stood out on its own. No single moment carried enough weight to justify concern. But repetition has its own force. The same small shifts. The same gentle reframing. The same confidence delivered without emphasis. Individually, they were meaningless. Together, they created distance between what I remembered and what I was told. There was a pattern forming, one I could sense before I could describe it. At this stage, trust was still intact. Strained perhaps, but present. And that mattered because trust doesn't announce itself. It operates in the background, handling decisions before conscious thought gets involved. Consistency does that. Predictable tone. Familiar routines. Reassurance delivered without urgency. The brain reads these signals and relaxes its scrutiny. So when doubt appeared, I turned it inward. I asked myself if I was overanalyzing. If stress had sharpened my reactions. If memory under pressure was simply unreliable. He never dismissed my questions. He welcomed them. That was the detail that delayed everything. Every concern was met with patience. Every doubt acknowledged, then gently reframed. Every disagreement resolved without conflict. There was nothing to prove. Nothing to confront. Nothing concrete enough to name. And yet, the effort required to stay certain began to increase. I noticed how often I paused before speaking. How frequently I searched for confirmation in his responses. How clarity now required validation. Trust was still there, but it no longer moved in both directions. If trust is built automatically, how do you recognize the moment it stops protecting you and starts guiding you somewhere else? There was a moment when everything almost aligned. A conversation that felt clearer than the rest. A pause where his words didn't redirect or soften anything. For a brief stretch of time, it seemed possible that the confusion had been mine all along. That possibility was comforting, because if the problem was internal, it could be managed. Stress, fatigue, overthinking. Explanations that didn't require confrontation. But clarity, when it arrives too easily, doesn't last. The next day, the same uncertainty returned. Not louder, more precise. Details I was certain about no longer landed the same way. Reactions were measured, responses carefully timed. And then there was the hour. Not the confession itself, just the timing of it. 2 a.m. is not an accidental hour. It sits outside routine, outside urgency, outside explanation. Nothing important had happened that day. No argument, no trigger. Yet that was when he chose to speak. He mentioned it only once. Briefly, as if the timing mattered less than the act of saying something at all. The confession existed. That much was clear. But its meaning remained out of reach. Why wait until 2 a.m. to say something that could change everything? After that, the silence changed. It wasn't absence. We still spoke. Still shared space. Still followed the same routines. But the space between sentences grew heavier. I noticed how often I replayed that night without replaying his words. How the hour itself carried more weight than what had been said. Intuition sharpened in small ways. A tightened response. A delayed answer. Eye contact held half a second longer than necessary. Nothing crossed into threat. Nothing justified alarm. And yet the body stayed alert. Sleep became shallow. Thoughts returned to the same question without resolving it. The mind searched for structure while the environment stayed calm. Silence stopped feeling neutral. It began to feel deliberate. And in that quiet, a realization surfaced, not fully formed, not yet ready to be trusted. Whatever he had shared at 2 a.m., it wasn't meant to be understood immediately. It was meant to sit there. Looking back, it wasn't a single moment that changed everything. It was the accumulation of small shifts, subtle enough to be dismissed at the time. Trust doesn't collapse from betrayal. It erodes from adjustment. Moments that seemed ordinary slowly became reference points for behavior. A sentence repeated slightly differently. A pause that redirected attention without comment. A reassurance that, in hindsight, guided perception more than comforted it. The past no longer felt fixed. Events I remembered clearly now carried a weight that didn't belong to them. Calm responses that once felt natural now appeared as markers of influence. What had seemed patience now revealed itself as subtle shaping. What had seemed agreement now looked like alignment under a quiet force. And the 2 a.m. confession, when it arrived, was not the start of the story. It was confirmation that the adjustments had already taken place. The meaning of what was whispered remained just beyond reach. For those paying attention, the pieces start to fall into place. But clarity, as always, comes slowly. After this realization, certainty became fragile. I began replaying conversations with a new awareness. Tone, timing, emphasis. All the small details demanded reconsideration. Memory, once trusted, now felt negotiable. Not wrong, not false, but no longer fixed. Anger never appeared. There was nothing tangible enough to direct it toward. Instead, self-doubt took its place. I questioned my recall. I questioned the sequence of events. I questioned myself. By the time I understood what was happening, I was already questioning my own memory. If your memory can be reshaped, what part of you is still yours? At exactly 2 a.m. he spoke. Not loudly, not in a way that demanded immediate reaction. Just a whisper, soft enough that I could have missed it if I hadn't been listening. The words themselves were incomplete. Fragments, pieces that seemed to float without context. Hints, suggestions, questions I couldn't answer in the moment. I remember catching certain phrases, but only fragments. Never thought you'd notice. It had to be done this way. You already understand. Each piece seemed significant, yet their meaning refused to settle. The confession didn't feel like an apology. It didn't feel like remorse. It didn't feel like anything I could act on. And that was the point. Because the more I tried to pin it down, the more it seemed to shift. The ambiguity became its own weight. What if the confession wasn't an apology, but a test? As the hours passed, the pieces began to line up. The small adjustments, the subtle reframing, the calm control over every conversation, they were no longer isolated events. Each moment that once felt ordinary now revealed itself as part of a larger sequence. The repeated small shifts. The guidance disguised as agreement. The reassurance that directed rather than comforted. It was not betrayal. Not in the way betrayal is usually understood. It was something different. A reshaping of perception, a quiet influence over understanding, a careful orchestration of reality. The confession at 2 a.m. didn't create the pattern. It revealed that the pattern had already been in place. Everything before it, every subtle adjustment, every reframed memory, suddenly made sense. The story was no longer about what was said at 2 a.m. It was about how everything had been quietly structured so that the confession could land with maximum impact. And in that realization, the tension didn't end. It deepened. Because now I knew the rules of the game. And the game had already been in play long before I even noticed. The fragments of the confession began to align in my mind. Not like a puzzle solved, but like a lens shifting focus. What I had taken for patience was strategy. What I had taken for agreement was influence. What I had assumed was guidance turned out to be deliberate orchestration. The confession at 2 a.m. wasn't a revelation of guilt. It was a revelation of awareness. He didn't need to explain. He didn't need to defend. He only needed to speak and let the framework we had unknowingly built do the rest. Everything that had seemed passive, incidental, or ordinary was intentional. The power dynamic had been quietly in place all along. And in that moment, I realized the most dangerous confessions don't reveal guilt. They reveal awareness. Awareness of exactly how much control can be exercised without ever raising alarm. The night, the silence, the timing, they were all part of the design. And suddenly, the story wasn't about what was said. It was about how everything had already been understood long before the words arrived. I turn to you now. Would you have trusted them? Think carefully, because the question isn't about the confession itself. It's about the quiet shifts you might have missed. The small patterns you might have ignored. The moments that felt too ordinary to question. What would you have noticed too late? If stories like this, stories that reveal how subtle shifts shape everything, interest you, consider subscribing. Not for alerts, not for noise, but to join a space where patterns, moments, and hidden truths can be seen together. Because some patterns are easier to understand when you don't face them alone.